Thank you to the Center for Business and Public Policy in the McDonough School. It's delightful to be here. It's the first time for me on the Georgetown University campus. Just to tell you a little bit about myself, I'm an applied microeconomist. I work at in the Venn diagrams, you might say, in the intersection of competitive strategy, industrial organization, and economics and regulation. And what I do typically in my work is I will write down relatively simple theory models and try to tease out the implications of them. And more recently, I've been using a lot of computational analysis to help understand the implications of those models. So this is work that is inspired by some of the people who are in this room, like Bob Gallimore and Russell Pittman. It's on railway restructuring and organizational choice, network quality, and welfare impacts, and it's joint work with Shana Kui, who is a graduate student at the School of Economics and Management at Beijing Jintang University. And this paper, let's see if we can get the slide advancer. There we go. So this paper is basically about the question of, let's imagine that we have a country that is about to privatize a formerly state-owned railway system, or is deregulating a railway system. How should it restructure it? And we're going to think about two broad choices. One is vertical separation, where we basically are going to separate out the above-the-rails transport operations from the below-the-rails infrastructure management. Sort of this is the direction, at least nominally, that the EU is planning on going. And the other option we'll look at is horizontal separation, what Russell Pittman calls systems competition. So we're going to have inter-system competition between a set of vertically integrated rail systems. And this is the approach, for example, that a number of Latin American countries have taken over the last 20 or 30 years. So just by way of literature review, I'll use this as kind of an opportunity to talk through some of the advantages and disadvantages that people have talked about when it comes to these two approaches. And by the way, of course, there are other approaches that countries could take to restructure their systems. You could imagine, for example, a vertically integrated network and transport operator, along with opening that system up to above-the-rails competition. So we're not going to talk about that. We're going to really talk about these two broad alternatives. So horizontal separation, some of the potential advantages there would include the ability to take advantage of economies of scope between transport operations and infrastructure management, the economies of vertical integration, if you will. The potential drawbacks might include that we're going to sacrifice potentially economies of network size. Potentially, we may worry about the impact on competition of that sort of system. Under vertical separation, the potential advantages, I guess I have to point this over in this direction. There we go. Potential advantages would be that this kind of approach would very explicitly foster competition among independent transport operators for that part of the vertical chain, transportation operation that we would think would be intrinsically competitive. Potential drawbacks would be that we may elevate transactions costs quite significantly in the negotiation and enforcement of contracts between the infrastructure company and the transport operators. And there's some empirical evidence that this approach results in higher operating costs, perhaps because of the sacrifice of economies of scope. So just to give you an overview of the research, the basic research question is, how do the alternatives of horizontal separation and vertical separation differ in terms of their impact on three metrics that economists would presumably care a lot about? Network quality, number one, consumer surplus, number two, and social welfare being, of course, the sum of consumer surplus and the profits of either the system under horizontal separation or the sum of the profits of the network management company and the transport operators under vertical separation. The approach that we're going to take is, as I said earlier, we're going to write down a model We're going to tease out the implication of each structure, presuming maximizing behavior by the relevant parties and equilibrium outcomes. This will be a multi-stage model in which profit-maximizing firms are first going to choose network quality, and then once quality is set, they're going to then compete on price. And then under vertical separation, we actually have a first stage where the regulator is going to choose an access tariff to maximize social welfare. We're going to characterize equilibrium behavior and its implications for network quality, consumer surplus, and social welfare. We're going to do this analytically where possible, but we're going to actually rely a lot to gain some insight on computational analysis, where we're going to look at a broad swath of parameter space in order to gain some insights. The contributions that we hope for in this paper really relate to whether we can gain any insight from using this kind of industrial organization style applied theory to really develop intuitions about how well horizontal separation and how well vertical separation perform on these key metrics of interest. This is, as far as we know, the first paper to comprehensively explore the impact of horizontal separation and vertical separation on both network quality and consumer surplus and social welfare. And then I would say, actually, thirdly, we're using some computational analysis techniques which I've not seen used in the applied I/O literature, and so perhaps we can think of this as also making a small methodological contribution. So just to give you an overview of the model, first, under vertical separation, we're going to imagine that we have two competing transport operators. They're going to operate on the infrastructure that's owned by a monopoly network firm. The regulator is going to begin by choosing a social welfare maximizing access tariff, which will have a fixed component and a variable access charge. Then the network firm will choose network quality to maximize its profits. And then given that quality, that's going to feed into the demand functions for transport services. The transport operators, given that quality, are going to compete on price by choosing prices to maximize profits. Under horizontal separation, we have two vertically integrated rail systems. Each system owns its own infrastructure and operates trains over that infrastructure. Each system begins by choosing independently and non-cooperatively their own network qualities. That then feeds into the demand functions, and then these two systems will compete on price. These systems, in each case, maximizing the profit of the entire chain. So just some key, I'm going to run through the kind of the details quickly because I really want to leave more time for sort of the applied implications. But we actually derive the demand functions from the maximization of a utility function by a representative consumer. What is important about this specification is these parameters BV and BK. So under vertical separation, the transport operators are going to be seen by consumers as providing substitute services, with BV being a parameter between 0 and 1 that denotes the degree of perceived product differentiation. BV, as it approaches 1, brings us closer to the case where the two transport operators are offering services that are perfect substitutes for each other. BV equal to 0 is a case where the transport operators are seen as operating completely undifferentiated services, and essentially each operator in that case is its own little monopoly. Under horizontal separation, there's a comparable parameter, but we're actually allowing for the possibility under horizontal separation for the two systems to actually be complementars to each other. So this actually fits kind of in an interesting way with the paper that was just presented. One thing to keep in mind, I'm going to be emphasizing this in a couple of places, that these parameters, although the BV and the BH, even though they're exogenous parameters in the model, are really parameters that are going to be influenced by policy decisions, and we can talk more about that later. There's a transport cost function under each system. For simplicity, we assume constant marginal cost and no fixed costs. Under horizontal separation, we have both variable costs and fixed costs. Firms are symmetric in both cases. Under vertical separation, we have a similar cost structure, but we allow for the possibility of economies of network size, which is parameterized by the parameter delta. And we're going to think of network quality as a fixed cost activity that could be potentially influenced by economies of network size as well. So just a really brief word about why systems under horizontal separation could actually be complementars to each other. So we talk about in the paper a state-owned rail system that serves 4 cities, A, B, C, and D. And if we imagine dividing it up as we see on the slide between 2 systems that are in parallel competition to some extent, but where each system also has a set of captive shippers, we argue in the paper that under this system, it's actually possible, depending on the patterns of traffic, for a decrease in the price of one system to actually lead to an increase in the volume of the other system. So our analytical approach, under horizontal separation is to solve for the equilibrium in the transport pricing subgame, given the network qualities, and then in step 2 to solve for the equilibrium network qualities. Under vertical separation, we're going to solve the regulator's problem first. The regulator sets an access tariff. Then we'll solve for the profit maximizing qualities, the profit maximizing network quality, and then in step 3 we'll solve for actually I'm doing this in reverse, aren't I? So we're going to solve for the symmetric equilibrium pricing game prices first, then we'll solve for the profit maximizing network quality, then we'll, in the last stage, we'll work backwards and solve for the welfare maximizing access tariff. So just to show you that we do get results, we can actually solve the model analytically. Everything is essentially linear and quadratic in the model. I'm not going to dwell on these other than to show you that we can do it. But I do want to note that because we can solve these analytically, we can see very, very clearly the reasons why equilibrium outcomes under vertical separation and horizontal separation actually differ from each other. And they differ really for 4 distinct reasons. First, the equilibrium transport prices and quantities differ because the network qualities under the 2 structures differ. That's number 1. And there's going to be a set of reasons that I'll explain in a moment why equilibrium network qualities differ. Secondly, equilibrium transport price and quantities may also differ because it's possible that the variable access charge set by the regulator may deviate from the marginal cost of network access. So that's a possible reason. And there's a pretty good reason why we might get a deviation of network access charge from marginal cost. There may be economies of network size. That's a third reason. That's something that would tend in some respects to favor vertical separation. And then we allow for the possibility that the cost parameters differ, reflecting some of the empirical evidence that vertical separation may be potentially a system that gives rise to higher operating costs. So what we're going to do first in terms of the analysis is we're going to try to isolate the structural incentives that make horizontal separation and vertical separation different from each other. So under horizontal separation, you actually have 2 vertically integrated firms choosing quality to maximize the profit of the entire chain. Under vertical separation, you have a network firm that's choosing network quality to maximize network profit, and then you have these separate entities choosing prices to maximize transport profit. So there's some important, it turns out, differences in terms of the fundamental structural incentives in these 2 structures. We also have analytical results in the paper, which I'm probably not going to have time to talk much about right now. And then we do computational analysis. So let me talk a bit about the structural incentives under these 2 systems and how they differ. And I'm going to do some graphical analysis that we probably should have put in the paper, but didn't when we wrote it. So there really are 4 different reasons why network quality, focusing just on that metric, would differ between horizontal separation and vertical separation. The first is what we call the marginal benefit of quality effect. This is really akin to double marginalization in a vertical model. Basically, under horizontal separation, quality maximizes network profit. Under vertical separation, it maximizes, under horizontal separation, quality maximizes system profit, and under vertical separation, quality maximizes just network profit. This is going to work to make network quality under vertical separation smaller than network quality under horizontal separation. Secondly, there's this effect that we call the horizontal coordination on quality effect. So under horizontal separation, the qualities of the networks are being chosen competitively. Whereas under vertical separation, there's a single network quality that gets chosen, and it's chosen, it's as if under vertical separation, the qualities of the two transport operators that they're experiencing are really being chosen collusively. So vertical separation kind of creates an as if a cooperative choice of quality, as it were. And this is also going to work to make quality under vertical separation less than under horizontal separation. The third effect that's important is the appropriability effect. So under horizontal separation, the systems appropriate the gains from network quality through the system profit margin, the transport price minus the marginal cost of transport operation minus the marginal cost of network access. Whereas under vertical separation, the appropriation occurs through the profit margin of the network firm, the variable access charge C star V minus the marginal cost of access eta. Now those two, the comparison of those two in general is ambiguous, but there's some pretty broad range of circumstances under which the appropriability effect tends to favor higher quality under horizontal separation. And finally, there's the possibility of economies of network size. And when there are economies of network size, which in the model corresponds to the parameter delta being greater than 0, that works to favor a higher quality under vertical separation. So just to give you a sense of how these look graphically, here's a graph with quality on the horizontal axis and dollars per unit of quality on the vertical axis. So the blue line is the marginal benefit of quality as perceived by the network firm. And the upward sloping line is the marginal cost of network quality as perceived by the network firm. And the intersection of those two gives us the quality chosen by the network firm, conditional actually on the variable access charge C. Under horizontal separation, there's a marginal benefit curve, which is the dotted red line, and there's a marginal cost curve given by the dotted blue line. And so the first two effects that I mentioned, the marginal benefit of quality effect and the horizontal coordination of quality effect, works to pivot up the marginal benefit of quality under horizontal separation. The appropriability effect is reflected in the difference in the intercepts of the two marginal benefit curves. This could go either way, it turns out, but in this picture I'm showing an appropriability effect that favors horizontal separation. And then finally, the economies of network size effect is reflected by a pivot downward in the marginal cost curve of quality, making the marginal cost curve for quality lower under vertical separation than under horizontal separation. Just a little bit more about the appropriability effect. Basically, the key insight that this slide is conveying is that as the regulator thinks about choosing the access charge, and the access charge is the variable access charge is actually going to be an important determinant of the network firm's profit margin, which is going to be an important determinant of the appropriability effect. The regulator is actually thinking about how this variable access charge affects incentives. And the regulator in this problem is really balancing two different distortions. There's a downward quality distortion due to the downstream market power in the transport market, and there's a downward quality distortion when the variable access charge is set equal to the marginal cost of network access. it is always the case that a higher variable access charge results in a higher network quality, but it's not always the case, it's not always the case that a higher variable access charge results in a higher level of output in the transport market. That latter derivative could either be positive or negative. And when a higher variable access charge results in higher quantity downstream in the transport market, that's actually kind of good for the regulator, because the regulator can simultaneously address both of these distortions, the quantity distortion and the quality distortion, simultaneously. And there's really not really a trade-off that the regulator really faces. That works to make the variable access charge relatively large, and the regulator will actually make it greater than the marginal cost of access in order to motivate both higher quantity and higher quality. But when a higher variable access charge results in lower downstream transport quantity, that's actually going to create a trade-off for the regulator. So let me show you what that looks like. So in this picture here, we have quality on the horizontal axis and quantity on the vertical axis. So the blue line shows us the combinations of quantity in the transport market and quality that are induced through variation in C. And the elbow there is exactly the point where the variable access charge is equal to the marginal cost of access. And in this case, what the regulator is able to do is to get a positive level of network quality, and he does so by choosing an access fee, variable access fee, that's greater than marginal cost of access. In this case, this is the case where the regulator faces a trade-off and operates essentially along the blue line. This is the blue line, again, giving us the available combinations of quantities and qualities that come about by varying the variable access charge. The curved lines are the isosocial welfare lines. And in this case, it works out that this trade-off is unfavorable enough that what the regulator ends up doing is choosing a variable access charge that's actually less than the marginal cost of access, and inducing a zero quality. Zero quality, by the way, in this model doesn't literally correspond to a set of tracks that are falling apart necessarily. Zero quality, think of zero quality as no upgrade in quality above the minimum mandated level under any sort of minimum quality regulation that the regulator may impose. So the case on the left-hand side occurs when the marginal cost of quality curve is flat, when there are big economies of network size, and when we have very intense price competition in the downstream transport market. The case on the right occurs when we have a relatively steep marginal cost of quality, when we have no economies of network size, and when we have relatively weak price competition in the downstream transport market. So let me talk a little bit about the computational analysis, and then I'll wrap up. So we compute equilibria and compare them over a wide swath of parameters that we believe are reasonably realistic. And here are the parameter values that we choose. But let me just give you a sense of the computational approach that we use. So to do the computations, we imagine the following thought experiment. Fix a focal parameter. For example, fix the competition intensity parameter under horizontal separation. And then imagine randomly choosing all other parameter values within their specified range from the previous slide. And then ask, under which proportion of these parameterizations do we get higher quality under horizontal separation, under which proportion of these parameterizations do we get higher consumer surplus, and under which proportion of these parameterizations do we get higher social welfare, and then take that focal parameter and vary it across its entire range. And when we do that for BH, we get the following picture. And the takeaways from this picture, for example, are that horizontal separation is likely to give higher network quality for almost all values of BH. It's likely to give higher consumer surplus for sufficiently positive values of BH, and it's likely to give higher social welfare for sufficiently positive values of BH, but not too positive, not too close to 1. And these results, if we do not just BH, but BV, and the steepness of the marginal cost of quality parameter, lambda, and the marginal cost of transport operations, gamma, we get these results. And what we see, for example, is that intense price competition among transport operators under VS tend to make it more likely that VS, in fact, tend to make it highly likely that VS has a higher consumer surplus and a higher social welfare, and moderately more likely that it has a higher network quality. Thank you. Want to point out that the bottom right picture, which is showing variations in lambda, don't, and in fact, actually, the picture in the bottom right also would apply to variations in the demand intercept A and the marginal cost of access eta. Variations in these parameters don't affect the relative rankings for some technical reasons, but basically the takeaway from the bottom right picture is that this is showing us kind of the general tendency across all parameterizations for one structure to dominate the other structure on each of these 3 metrics. So we see a very, very strong tendency for horizontal separation to dominate vertical separation with respect to quality, and a somewhat modest, not overwhelming tendency for vertical separation to outperform horizontal separation with respect to consumer surplus and social welfare. Now you might wonder, are there cases under which one structure outperforms the other structure on all 3 dimensions? That's what this set of pictures shows us. So for example, we see that vertical separation is moderately likely to dominate horizontal separation on all 3 categories, on all 3 metrics, when competition intensity BV is sufficiently high. We see that there is a tendency for horizontal separation to pretty highly likely dominate vertical separation for values of BH that are positive but not too close to 1, so strong competition but not cutthroat competition between these 2 systems. And then finally, it's really not likely in general that either approach, either structure will dominate the other for all parameterizations. So I'm going to not talk about robustness checks given the time and just go right to conclusions and implications. So one implication I think of this analysis is that one size does not fit all. Neither horizontal separation nor vertical separation dominates on all 3 metrics for a wide range of parameterizations. Specific circumstances matter, and the choice among these structures may involve the need for policymakers to prioritize what they consider to be important. Do you consider network quality to be more important than consumer welfare? Do you consider social surplus to be the most important metric? Which one you consider to be most important may shape the choice that you make here. There is this strong tendency for horizontal separation to result in a higher network quality than vertical separation due to the combination of structural factors that I talked about earlier. There's a somewhat weaker tendency for vertical separation to dominate on consumer surplus and social welfare. The best case scenario for vertical separation to outperform horizontal separation is that you have very, very strong competition over the rails between transport operators, where that BV parameter is very, very close to 1. And where economies of network size are significant. The best case scenario for horizontal separation to dominate on all 3 metrics, and maybe in particular on social welfare and consumer surplus, is where you can structure a system where the systems are competitors, not complementors, but where the competition is workable competition, not cutthroat competition. And so, just to wrap up, one big meta implication of the work that we see is that these intensity of competition parameters, these product differentiation parameters, are really choices to some extent, or are influenced by choices to some extent that policymakers can make. Under horizontal separation, BH would be determined, at least in part, by exactly how the existing network is divided up into competing systems, and the extent of shipper captivity that would result under these alternative designs also perhaps would be determined, at least in part, by rules governing mandatory trackage rights. Under vertical separation, the competition intensity parameter is going to be governed, at least in part, by regulations that establish service standards and network access. And so, as countries think about restructuring their formerly state-owned systems, the existing legacy rail system is going to matter, and the capacity of regulatory institutions is going to matter as well. I'll call attention to a very nice analysis that Russell Pittman has done of Mexico's privatization back in the late 1990s that I think illustrate some of the points that we're making in this model. I might mention just at the end, this particular paper has been published already, but but we still very much welcome your comments, because this is part of a broader agenda that I hope eventually will culminate in our ability to do a fairly detailed analysis of railway restructuring in China. So with that, I hope I didn't run over too much. Question?
Nate Vomisil, FRA. So just as a comment, I think that the situation in the United States is pretty reflective of that moderate competition. So I think that's a pretty good reality check on your results. But I did have, under horizontal separation, I'd be very interested. I mean, there's a lot of math involved there, so I obviously can't do it on the fly, but making certain assumptions like if there was a reliability difference between the horizontally separated people such that one could have lower quality, lower price, but still be essentially no product differentiation. The shipper doesn't care which one they ship with and see what falls out of that math.
That'd be interesting to do. So that's kind of, I think I hear you saying, perhaps, if I'm understanding you correctly, that we might imagine a situation where we have a vertical quality differentiation, but not a horizontal product differentiation. And so we have not considered that. That would be a useful case, I think, to look at. We do consider the possibility of asymmetries in costs under both horizontal separation and vertical separation. The model presumes a lot of symmetry, but it turns out that that symmetry in cost is actually not that important. We get pretty much the same insights in a model where we allow the costs of the two transport operators or the cost of network access under horizontal separation to be different.
Right. I think it would be interesting if you actually set that product differentiation to zero, very close to zero, and assume, even though that they have a lower quality, the shipper is going to say, basically, we don't care because we know when our product's going to get there. We'll just ship it a little earlier.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that'd be an interesting case to consider.
Yeah, sorry. James Nolan, University of Saskatchewan. Hi, Professor Besanko. Thanks for a great presentation. Very detailed model. I think most of us in the room would kind of identify with the results you have. They kind of fit my intuition as to how these two systems would compare. Just a couple points for you. There's a paper by James Cox and Offerman from 2002 where they ran an experiment where they compared HS and VS for the Netherlands. So you might want to have a look at that just to say, okay, this is an early take on, we can't do the analytics or we don't want to, so we'll do the experiment and see which one picks out. I'm doing an experimental paper later, so that's why I know about this paper. Thank you. The other thing, there's a guy named Rich Sexton at UC Davis who does a fair bit of computational analysis around parametric type models like this, and I can give you the links if you want. You might want to see what he's done. He does a vertical model in terms of an agricultural supply chain, and it's actually not dissimilar. Your exact computational things you did, I'm not 100% sure exactly what you did, but he does very, very similar type analyses where he says, okay, we got a computational space, we'll do a parameterization, and we'll run different models. So there's some references there you might need too.
Yeah, thank you for both of those. And just a comment on your initial point about intuition being confirmed. That was what I felt, what I ended up liking about this work, and one always has to like one's own work to some extent when one is finished with it. But what I liked about this was that it did seem, at the end, ultimately to be consistent with a lot of the things that Russell has written, with my intuition about the U.S. rail system, and that's reassuring. it may maybe take away from the novelty of the research. Maybe
No, no,
it would be more novel if it was counterintuitive.
Right, I read the back bit here too, and you seem to be, you do a good job trying to fit these previous examples and saying this is what must have happened in order to make this work, right? That's a really good job, actually.
Yeah,
so.
yeah. So it was reassuring that we got some
Sort of
results
what we
that
thought we
seemed
should get,
that seemed to be consistent with what others have been talking about.
Very good, thank you.
Yes, please.
Steve Dittmeyer, retired ferroequinologist. Excellent presentation.
Thank you.
A couple decades ago, the European Commission issued regulations requiring their railways in their member states to separate into infrastructure companies and operating companies and to introduce competition between the operating companies. Years have passed. But now, on the basis of your research, what would you recommend to the European Commission now to continue and strengthen the vertical separation requirements, or to back off, as some member states would actually prefer?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And so I think the first thing I would say is, EU, tell me what you really care about. Do you care primarily about a high-quality, safe network? If you care about that, then vertical separation may not necessarily be the way that you want to go, because our results are suggesting that vertical separation does less well in terms of delivering high levels of network quality. So tell me what you care about, first of all. If you care about consumer welfare, or you care about social welfare, then we can talk. But then I would need to know maybe a little bit more about what the possibilities would be in terms of horizontal separation. So I need to know about that. I'd also really, really want to care about rules governing network access and whether we truly could have. I mean, our model is a model where there is complete non-discriminatory access, where the network firm is not running a competitor transport operator. So I would really want to know more about what the EU is able to do to guarantee that non-discriminatory access. And we know, as the EU has kind of been working its way toward this goal of vertical separation, that they've struggled with that. And what is, the model makes vertical separation seem really, really easy, but vertical separation in practice involves a whole host of considerations involving separation of management, separation of the accounting, of the profitability of the above the rails and below the rails parts of the system. So I guess my general tendency would be to say, look, if you care a lot about network quality, maybe it's worth rethinking a little bit the VS model. But there's a lot of stuff we need to think through carefully. I think that's a lesson of the model before we ultimately come down on one side or the other. I hope that's responsive.
Russ Pittman, three small points, if I may. Well, first, in response to your last point about non-discriminatory access pricing, I've always been struck by the sort of internal contradiction of that. Setting access prices, when we tell people to set access prices, we tell them to do 10 things. Let's have efficient access. Let's have non-discriminatory, and they're contradictory. And we economists,
it might be, yeah.
And we economists all know that, in fact, just in the presence of high fixed costs, discrimination is efficient. So there's a real trade-off there between, yes, we competition guys love non-discriminatory access. We guys who want the rail system to make up their fixed costs might like some Ramsey pricing or some two-part tariffs or something like that. Second point, briefly, I think it's a much broader issue and Steve raised it. But if you look at the world experience, one of the great advantages, and I may talk about this later in the roundtable, of horizontal separation is that it has been so successful in attracting private investment into the system itself.
Yeah, I should have mentioned that in my literature review, that you have written about that, of course.
Yeah, I mean, both in the U.S., but also in Mexico and Brazil. Yeah. If you can figure out ways to have private firms either own or have control, long-term control of the infrastructure, the experience is you get huge amounts of private investment into the system that you just don't get in these vertical separated models in Europe. Yeah. And I think it's an underappreciated virtue of the horizontal separation, of the U.S., Canadian, Mexican, Brazilian type model.
Right, I completely agree. And actually, it's an interesting question, Russ, the extent to which we could actually, if we were to put capital investment into our model, which I think we probably could do pretty easily. I think it would track pretty closely with the investment in network quality. I think
Yes,
those
I
two
agree,
would
I
be,
agree.
I think the behavior theoretically of those would be the same. And so this model would very strongly support the perspective that you just expressed, that HS may have a pretty significant advantage with respect to capital investment relative to VS.
And then last just small point. I think in the course of this long and great presentation, you never used the words freight or passenger. But when you say one size doesn't fit all, it seems like a solution for a passenger-intensive system like Germany might be completely different than a freight-dominant system like the US.
Yeah, and I think that's a point that you've made to me privately, and I think Bob Gallimore has said the same thing as well. I completely agree, and I should have slipped freight in there in a couple of places, and maybe I could have, but thank you.
One last comment question on the vertical separation model. It would appear that unless there is pricing structures that are very different from those we have seen in any vertical separation model to date, that effectively when you choose the vertical model and go to that, you basically lock the transportation, the rail network, into the markets that it is serving on that date, effectively. That unless there is pricing, part of the pricing structure for the access to the vertically separated network is designed to capture the cost of adaptation to future markets, that it is very unlikely that the vertical separation model becomes a sustainable model over the long term.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. And our model, of course, is not capturing that because it's a static model and not a dynamic model. So I think two kind of quick responses in terms of this agenda. So one thing that we're working on now is a set of models around access pricing under vertical separation. And it seems to me that this is ground that the telecommunications guys have kind of taken or took in the late 1990s and early 2000s that I would love to see the railroad economists kind of like, weigh in on. And I think they're really interesting trade-offs even in a static model of access. But I think a dynamic model of access and what that would imply for vertical separation is absolutely necessary part of the research agenda.
David, John Mayo from Georgetown. Your last answer, I think, anticipated my question or observation. That is that in the vertical separation model, you've got a situation where the regulator is setting the access price that sounds a lot like a price cap. And of course, you know that there's been just a plethora of work done in telecom and electricity on the impact of price caps on, among other things, quality. So this may yet add one more reason in your list of reasons why it would be the case that horizontal separation may, in a quality sense, dominate vertical separation.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think the one difference between those literatures and rail, I think, is that in those literatures, there's been much more this focus on not so much pure vertical separation, but a vertically integrated firm with over the rail or the competitive sector competition in the competitive sector. So there's a lot of focus on the efficient components pricing rule and stuff like that, and where issues of kind of access and foreclosure are really super important. I think because vertical separation, to me at least, is more feasible to imagine in rail, I think kind of exploring what happens under pure vertical separation is maybe, I think we can add in this literature more than what the telecom people and the electricity people have done.
Ferdinando Monte, Georgetown. So this is more of a comment towards your sort of last stated objective of thinking about regulating China and it's changing transportation infrastructure. So one thing that obviously happens when you develop a rail system is that economic activity changes around the rail, and sometimes it's created and sometimes it's reallocated away from some places and going to other places. So that means that from the perspective of your model, you're not going to have only changes along the demand curve of transportation, you're going to have changes in the demand curve, right? And so that's going to affect the way you think about the consumer surplus.
Right.
So I'm wondering,
Right.
I'm not wondering, this is more of a comment, but maybe some attention should be reserved to that when you go down the road and move towards more empirical.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point as well, that, you know, we're really very narrowly focusing on, I mean, social welfare is really just the stakeholders in this vertical structure that we're looking at, and not really, we're not really considering welfare more broadly, and looking at some of those, looking at some of those external effects, I think would be very, very useful to do. When you're talking about doing a big restructuring of a country's system, of course, they would become maybe as important to policymakers as any of the things that we're talking about here.
Okay, thank you, David.
Thank you.